It is becoming increasingly clear that Ukraine is going to win this war and that the Kremlin faces a historic crisis of confidence. Indeed, I now believe it is a genuine possibility that Vladimir Putin's exposed weaknesses are so severe that we might be witnessing the beginning of the end, not only of his regime, but of the Russian Federation itself. This vast empire, encompassing more than 120 ethnic groups, is on an unsustainable footing, and like that famous Hemingway quote, its collapse may be gradual at first but could quickly become a sudden, violent and uncontrollable event. If we fail to prepare for this possibility in the way that we failed to prepare for the collapse of the Soviet Union, it could introduce immense instability to our geopolitics. I see at least 3 factors that could lead to the Federation's collapse. The first is the breakdown of domestic confidence in the Russian army, which has traditionally been at the core of the Kremlin's legitimacy. Its humiliation in Ukraine is now almost complete, with the proud Black Sea Fleet still hiding behind Crimea, too frightened to take action against a country that doesn't even have a navy. And Russian men, once enticed by the military's pay offers, are shunning recruitment en masse in the knowledge of the fate the battlefield holds for them. This has exacerbated the disproportionate recruitment of ethnic minorities from Chechnya and other nations on the edges of the Federation, the easiest groups to use as cannon fodder, which has raised grievances that won't easily be forgotten. If some militant Chechens were to decide to trigger another war of independence, where would Putin find the military resources to fight it now that he has dedicated so much to Ukraine? He will no doubt be aware that if such a war is won quickly and decisively by the Chechens, it could trigger a wave of similar insurgencies across the Federation. Second, the damage suffered by the Russian economy has been too devastating to sustain a population of 144 million. The loss of energy markets, which compensated for the country's lack of modern industries, cannot be reversed. European governments will not rely again on Nord Stream 1, having witnessed how easily it can be turned off, and are already making long-term investments in domestic energy supply. Russia has also relied on arms exports, but which country will be interested in buying its equipment or weapons now? Such an economic crisis can be sustained for months in the misplaced hope that business will one day return, but even in Russia the well of stoicism has its limits. This brings us to the third factor, which is the sparse nature of Russia's population. For despite possessing 70 times the landmass of the United Kingdom, the Federation has just twice the population. These numbers make civic solidarity difficult to achieve in the best of times, but now, with the metropole in a weak position, any sense of national identity could rapidly deteriorate. Western sanctions will force Moscow's elites to make difficult economic trade-offs. They will inevitably bail out the middle classes in the capital, who pose a more immediate threat to officials, to the detriment of minority populations in the constituent nations. Seen this way, it is shocking how little discussion there has been about the potential end of the Russian Federation. We ought to be asking difficult questions now lest they be sprung on us out of nowhere. For instance, how would this play out in a country that has considerable stockpiles of nuclear weapons and few centers of power? Who would extract the nukes? How do we avoid leakage of weapons and militants into the Baltic states? Is a major internal conflict inevitable, or can the collapse be contained within a political context? Combined, these dilemmas pose a very significant challenge for the West. Get it wrong and we could face disaster. Our failure to prepare for the last Russian collapse some 30 years ago, and the internal unrest that ensued in its aftermath, arguably led to the Putin presidency. We cannot risk being unprepared a second time. The Ukraine war has entered a new and more dangerous phase with the mobilization of reservists to fill the manpower gaps left by the damage inflicted on the Russian army since February. Vladimir Putin announced the move just as the eastern Ukrainian provinces under Russian control said they would hold referendums to demonstrate popular support for Moscow rather than Kiev. Both are the desperate measures of an increasingly beleaguered leader whose hopes of a quick and easy victory in Ukraine were shattered weeks ago. Since the former soldiers making up the reserve will not be ready for combat for months, Mr. Putin is evidently digging in for a long war with a likely counteroffensive in the spring. By then, however, the Ukrainian army will be better equipped with NATO weapons and far more committed to the defense of their homeland than the aggressor is to its invasion. Putin may call up more troops, but even his elite forces have failed against a determined and well-armed opponent, and there is no reason to believe the attrition will not continue. The big question that Western strategists need to answer is what happens when it is apparent to the Kremlin and the Russian people that there is nothing but more misery lying ahead. Early predictions of a coup against Putin have, sadly, come to naught. If anything, the threats to his leadership come from hardline nationalists who want the war prosecuted with even greater brutality. Moreover, the Kremlin controls the message, and while people know the casualties have been high, he is able to use the media to revive the old, but deeply held, Russian grievance that the motherland is under threat from the West. The fact that this is a preposterous assertion does not make it any less compelling in Russia itself, where suffering at the hands of Western powers down the centuries has been mythologized. At the UN General Assembly, Western leaders lined up to denounce Putin, but they need to be backed by China, India, Turkey and big non-aligned nations who might usually prefer to stay neutral. No one can afford to stand idly by while threats to use nuclear weapons are made. The whole world needs to make it absolutely clear to Putin what the consequences of widening this war will be and prepare for just such a prospect. It is no longer sensible simply to trust that his deranged threat to use nuclear weapons is a bluff. The US has been sending secret messages to Russia to warn that it will face grave consequences if it conducts a nuclear strike in Ukraine.
Deliberately vague, the memos are designed to keep the Kremlin guessing over how Joe Biden, the US president, would respond.
US officials told the Washington Post newspaper the private communications had been dispatched regularly for the last several months. The revelation emerged after Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, on Wednesday issued a threat to retaliate with nuclear weapons. Western officials have played down the chances of the Kremlin leader using nuclear weapons, noting he has said similar things in the past. Berlin has said many Russians being called up to fight in the war in Ukraine do not want to take part, adding that this was welcome. Many Russians who are now being called up do not want to take part in this war either. This is a good sign, a government spokesperson told a regular news conference. A way must be left open for Russians to come to Europe and also to Germany, the spokesperson added. A Dutch TV show has satirized the Kremlin's sham referenda for parts of eastern Ukraine to become part of Russia by offering its citizens a chance to vote to be part of the Netherlands. Don't listen to Putin's lies, it says. What he doesn't tell you is that Russia originally belonged to the Netherlands.
Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko said he was not planning a mobilization after his close ally Russia announced it was calling up hundreds of thousands of reservists for the war in Ukraine. The mobilization is in Russia. There will be no mobilization here, state media quoted Lukashenko as saying.
The president, in power since 1994, said he was commenting on rumors that he planned to announce new measures in Belarus to support Moscow's invasion of Ukraine.
Russia is Belarus' main backer and the two neighbors are part of a borderless so-called union state. Belarus also borders northern Ukraine and served as a staging post for Russian troops, missiles and aircraft, both before and during Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
We will fight only when we have to defend our home, our land, the state-run Belta news agency quoted Lukashenko as saying on Friday. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Thursday demanded President Vladimir Putin be held to account as he faced Russia in a Security Council session in which the United Nations catalogued abuses in Ukraine. Pressure has swelled against Moscow as world leaders attend the UN General Assembly, but in the highly anticipated first encounter between the top Russian and US diplomats since the war in Ukraine, the Kremlin and its critics for the most part spoke past one another. The very international order we've gathered here to uphold is being shredded before our eyes, Mr. Blinken told the Security Council in a special session. Mr. Blinken accused Putin of adding fuel to the fire with recent steps including calling up reservists and planning referendums in Russian-held Ukrainian territory just as Kyiv made gains on the ground. Ukraine on Thursday deleted a statement saying Energy Minister German Galashchenko had discussed the possibility of sanctions on Russia's nuclear power supplier Rosatom with U.S. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm. An Energy Ministry spokeswoman cited a misunderstanding when asked why the statement had disappeared from the ministry's website, but she did not elaborate. The initial statement was replaced by one that said Mr. Galashchenko had stressed the importance of clean energy when he met Ms. Granholm in the United States. The later statement made no mention of Rosatom. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said last month it was not normal that Western countries have not yet imposed sanctions on Rosatom.